Okay, welcome to part 2 of going through Justin Baldoni's lawsuit to Blake Lively. This is not my job. I don't get paid for this, so please follow me. It's 2 in the morning and we are only halfway done. So, another part about Blake Lively's lawsuit, when I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, Justin Baldoni is such a creep, is he allegedly called her hot during the scene where she was wearing a onesie. According to this lawsuit, what Baldoni actually said was he said, it will be hot, as it was 90 degrees in the small bar with no air conditioning. Lively mischaracterizes this in her complaint as Baldoni referring to her personally as hot, using the slang term. And in the footnotes of this section, it says this entire interaction was documented on camera and they have the receipts. This is yet another example that if this is true, presumably it is, and it goes to court, and they have footage of him saying it will be hot and not calling her hot, and she tried to basically completely ruin this person's life over something that was a very malicious fabrication of the context of what was really said. That's not going to look good for her. And this is kind of why my predominant theory is that Ryan Reynolds is behind this, because it really feels like at a certain point Blake Lively just stopped wanting to be in contact with Justin Baldoni, and someone behind the scenes took over and was contacting everybody, Sony, Wayfair, Baldoni. It was all going through Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds' people. I think that this was Ryan Reynolds, because this is the only explanation for me, because if Blake Lively knew the truth, I can't imagine she would be willing to risk her entire reputation trying to take someone else down when it doesn't seem like the facts are on her side. Okay, so this next part is a little bit uncomfortable for me to read because it's not appropriate, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's important. Blake Lively alleged in her complaint that Justin Baldoni was basically this creep who kept bringing up all of these sexual things and specifically referenced a conversation where they were talking about orgasming for a sexual scene in the film. So the lawsuit states that the character Ryle was not to orgasm after he satisfied Lily, the character. Lively remarked as herself and said, I'd be mortified if that happened to me, personalizing the character's sexual act. Baldoni, following Lively's lead in what he understood to be an attempt to connect with the characters, remarked that those have been some of the most beautiful moments between him and his wife. They then moved on. So Justin Baldoni was basically saying, I satisfy my wife. It seems like Ryan Reynolds doesn't satisfy his. That's just what it says. I'm sorry. She also accused Justin Baldoni about constantly bringing up porn, but apparently another instance that was caught on camera was Lively started that conversation, and she said, I don't want it to look like porn, and opened up that she had never seen porn in her life. Baldoni complimented her and said that's wonderful, because unfortunately he was exposed to it as a young age and developed an addiction, which is something he's discussed in his book and his podcasts. So it was actually Blake Lively, allegedly, that brought up that conversation to begin with. So Justin Baldoni's lawyer also disputes the claim that Blake Lively made in her complaint, where she said she felt uncomfortable that Justin Baldoni hired his friend to play the OBGYN. They state that Baldoni casting an experienced actor who happens to be a friend is no different than casting Lively's sister, who was cast because she is Lively's sister. So I didn't realize this, but they actually did hire Blake Lively's sister for this film, so she did have a role. And then they explain that the actor portraying the OBGYN is actually an award-winning Shakespearean-trained actor with a master's degree in acting from UCLA. Now, this next part, I want you guys to pay attention because it is probably the most damning piece of information for Blake Lively, and it is ultimately the reason why I was so on her side to begin with, because it's really starting to seem like she grossly misled the public with this one little thing, but it's very, very important, possibly the most important thing. It is crucial to note that the list of grievances read at the ambush meeting where Ryan Reynolds verbally assaulted Justin Baldoni allegedly was separate and apart from the 17-point return to production demands and were never presented to any of the parties present. Though Lively's complaint misleadingly suggests the parties agreed to a list of 30 items, many of the items listed on her complaint were new, entirely based in lies, and neither read nor provided to any of the parties, let alone agreed to. The only document presented to the parties was the 17-point return to production demands presented on November 9th and signed over 2 weeks after this meeting on January 9th. So the reason why that's so huge is the way that Blake Lively's lawyers wrote her complaint is she put down this list of 30 grievances at the beginning. And she made it seem like Justin Baldoni and Jamie Heath signed on to those grievances of all of those little specific things of walking in the trailer and sexual harassment and watching her when she was breastfeeding and smelling her hair and bringing up porn and all of those really, really messy stuff. That actually isn't what was agreed to in the meeting. So there was a 17-point list that was some of the more generic things that they agreed to because it was already in the contracts. And then there was a 30-point list that she wrote after the fact that nobody ever saw, but then she included in the lawsuit to make it seem like they agreed to that, which is actually like definitely grounds for defamation because it really is that misleading. I hope that I did a good enough job explaining why that's so significant. Then the next 30 pages, you guys know, just sort of details all the screenshots of the editors, the producers, the castmates. What it really does is it paints a picture of Blake Lively, sort of everybody treating her the way that they treated Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada. As soon as she walks in, everybody's bending over backwards for her. They're giving her the dailies. They're letting her have the producer credits. They're letting her edit the movie. They're just completely bending over backwards for her because she was constantly threatening to destroy everybody's reputation and not market the film. So it definitely does a good job of lending credence to the claim that she tried to take over the film. Another piece of evidence that is very damning to Blake Lively and wasn't in the original lawsuit that Justin Baldoni filed, which is why I said I wanted to see proof of this, is they do in fact have proof that they screen tested both Justin Baldoni's version of the film as well as Blake Lively's version of the film with an audience, and they scored his significantly higher, 20% higher, rated his film as excellent versus Blake Lively's version. And significantly, the only group that it polled well with was actually men, which is not the target audience for this film. Need I remind you, since it's become completely lost, that this film was about domestic violence and was a film for women. So Justin Baldoni kind of rightfully used this as evidence that they should have used his version of the film, but Blake Lively reneged on her promise and insisted that her version be released to the public instead of Baldoni's cut, even claiming that the book's author, Colleen Hoover, would refuse to promote the film as well if Blake Lively's version was not chosen. Okay, you guys know these pages. Basically, he was shunned from the film. He had a spinal cord injury. He was in the hospital. He was sent to the basement for his own premiere, which is pretty terrible. And then another significant aspect is Blake Lively was adamant about getting the PGA designation mark. So this is a coveted producer credit that is taken very seriously in Hollywood. So the only reason that I think that Blake Lively wanted this so bad is I believe that she possibly thought that she was going to receive an Oscar for this film, if not for Best Actress, which is hilarious. She would never obviously get that. But if the film was nominated for Best Picture, the producers are the ones that receive the Oscar. So if she has the PGA credit, that's a huge thing for her resume to have an Oscar. So I think that's the reason why she had that. And then ultimately when they said no, that's when she messaged them and said, any goodwill between us is done. So that was her red line. After, they still capitulated to her and eventually gave her the PGA credit, but apparently it wasn't enough for Blake after seemingly getting literally everything that she wanted according to these receipts. And she still decided to make this public. Another piece of this lawsuit that I think most people missed is a very subtle Taylor Swift call out here. So listen to this. The other cast members also unfollowed Baldoni, creating the false impression that Baldoni had done something wrong. Lively was leaving what she had earlier referred to as crumbs, a social media strategy she had learned from a close celebrity friend to give fans just enough to allow them to come to their own conclusions, thereby launching an army of detectives that, on information and belief, Lively hoped would turn against Baldoni. So they're alleging that Lively orchestrated this and sort of left the breadcrumbs. I think that's an obvious reference to Taylor Swift, who is known to sort of leave little hints and unfollow people and do this and that because she knows she's under such a microscope. She can do the tiniest little thing to completely shift the narrative in such a dramatic way. Now, you might be wondering, but why did Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds care so much about taking over this film? And I think the obvious explanation is that they wanted the rights to the sequel. It was a commercial success. I believe that Blake Lively saw how successful Deadpool was and wanted to emulate that and thought that this was her moment. And she used her husband's power of owning his own production company to extort the rest of the cast members into complying because they wanted to be part of the sequel.